From Microbe TV, this is TWiP, This Week in Parasitism, episode 241, recorded on August 12, 2024. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about parasites. Joining me today from New York, Daniel Griffin.
Hello, everyone.
What's on your tie, Daniel?
You know, I totally forgot that we're recording tonight, and it's just coincidentally happened to wear my Giardia bow tie. So
perfect. Perfect. Also joining us from Fort Lee, New Jersey, Dixon Despommier.
Hello, Vincent and Daniel and Christina, of course. Everybody. The weather outside is nice for a change. Really nice.
Yeah, it's been a bit cloudy the past few days. Today's nice.
It has.
Very good. Also joining us from Glasgow, Scotland, Christina Naula.
Good evening, everybody. It's been a really good day here in Glasgow, busy. I was spotting some bats on my evening walk. I made strawberry jam, and now I'm kind of finishing off the evening with a TWiP recording, which is also really good. So good to be here.
The high point, dare we say.
The high point, absolutely, yes.
Exactly right,
Definitely.
exactly right. Have any plans for making scones for that strawberry jam?
Well, I'd have to see if it sets first. It's always a bit of a challenge.
Oh, I see.
Well, this is the TWiP reveal for the last clinical case, which was from 239. Daniel, what do we have here?
All right. For those tuning in for the first time, those tuning back in, our case was a man in his 70s, originally from mainland China, then Hong Kong, who has been living in the United States for decades, admitted to the hospital with fever for 6 days. He reports that he saw his primary care physician in Queens. I should probably tell people, where is Queens, right? So, you've got this New York tri-state area, and you've got sort of the northeastern part of the U.S. You've got New York City, which in my mind is Manhattan, and then there are the outer boroughs, right? So there's Brooklyn, which my parents hail from, Queens, where I was born, which is really Western Long Island, Staten Island, and the Bronx. Right?
That's four.
Let's see, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx.
You got a problem with that? Does that give you a hint what you left out?
So, Brooklyn. So Queens, which is really Western Long Island, I like to point out, as is Brooklyn. So this gentleman lives there in Queens, goes to see his physician in Queens, and then is referred to the hospital after his blood work revealed a sodium level of 123 and an increased monocyte count, right? So the fact that he's got fever and he's sick, it's the salt level. Now, when I see this gentleman, it's a week I'm covering on the weekend at one of the many hospitals. This patient reports drenching sweats. Now, he says he does lots of outdoor activity, walking in the local parks in Queens. But I just want to point out, he's walking in the parks in the city. He reports that he does not feel particularly sick, despite the fever, the drenching sweats. So sort of a stoic fellow. As far as other medical problems, he does have hypertension. He does have BPH. That's a benign prostatic hypertrophy. No prior surgical histories. He's retired. He currently is not married. He says he has no wife. Really get much more into that, but he does have one son. So something happened there. Doesn't have any pets, no exotic exposures or recent travel other than the geographic background I give to you. And when I see him, he actually is quite febrile to 39.5. It's got a rapid heart rate, actually met sepsis criteria, so rather ill. But the rest of the exam is really unremarkable. We do have some labs where he has a normal white blood cell count, but his eosinophils are 0. He has elevated neutrophils and monocytes. As mentioned, that low sodium, it's 123. He's got elevated serum aminotransferases. Those are those AST, ALTs, low platelets. pulse, a low hematocrit, and actually gets a scan, a sort of head-to-toe CAT scan, chest, abdominal, pelvis, all unremarkable.
All right, we had a good number of guesses for August, so let's start with Dixon.
Okay. Mark writes, hello. Thank you for continuing to provide such entertaining and informative content over many years now. As a staff member at a public health laboratory, I think the case in episode 239 could be diagnosed in a room across from my desk. I would venture to guess a deer tick made a meal of this patient during one of his walks, or with or without him knowing it. During this time, a transmission of either Babesia microti or Borrelia burgdorferi occurred. Sweating and a lower red blood cell count leads me to think the patient is suffering from babesiosis. Wait a minute, I just disconnected myself.
I think you're good.
No, I did.
Oh.
Give me a break here.
Right.
I'm working on this feverishly as we speak. No pun intended. Yes, sweating from a blood smear can confirm the diagnosis. It is quite common to have a confection with Lyme and perhaps worth a look as well.
Christina.
Robin writes, Dear TWiP love the show, have been listening since 2011. I especially enjoy the cases and the challenge to identify the offending parasite. Also, I want the book in capitals. Regarding a gentleman in his 70s, originally from mainland China, Hong Kong, now living in New York City, who presented with fever for 6 days, drenching sweats, decreased sodium, elevated monos on
DIF.
In the blood smear on DIF, elevated LFTs and low HCT and platelets, and a history of walking in parts in Queens. My diagnosis is babesiosis, specifically Babesia microti. B. microti is a protozoa transmitted by the black-legged tick, aka the deer tick, which is endemic in New York State, although the natural hosts are small rodents such as field mice. Infections of erythrocytes leads to hemolytic anemia and cytokine production, causing aperiodic fever plus or minus drenching sweats, hepatosplenomegaly and tachycardia, and as noted in Parasitic Diseases 6th edition, B cells may be important mediators of B. microti infection, hence elevated monos on differential. On diff, is that the same? It's not the same.
Yes, it is the same. Yeah, different.
Is it the same? Thank you. Sorry, that's the non-clinician speaking. Diagnosis is made upon identifying infected RBCs with extracellular ring forms on thick and thin blood smears with Giemsa stain and or PCR as part of larger tick-borne disease panel that includes anaplasmosis, Borrelia, ehrlichiosis, and babesiosis. A classical finding is a tetrad of intracellular ring forms, the Maltese cross, with extracellular ring forms. Co-infection with anaplasma and Borrelia can occur as both diseases are vectored by the black-legged tick. Mild infections usually resolve spontaneously. However, moderate and severe manifestations may require prompt treatment. For moderate infection with atavaquone and azithromycin. For severe infection, use clindamycin, quinine, plus or minus exchange transfusion. Severe cases can lead to, help me, Daniel, DIC?
So DIC, disseminated intracoagulation, DIC.
Okay, thank you. MSOF and death. I don't know what MSOF is either.
Yeah, let me see. What is MSOF? Multi-organ dysfunction syndrome.
Okay, brilliant.
Yeah, so we're using disseminated intravascular coagulation and our multi-organ dysfunction syndrome.
And death. Differential diagnosis version, other plasmodium infections, tick-borne infections, toxoplasmosis. Shall I read out the long version or shall we just keep it with the short differential diagnosis version?
I think you can keep it short. These will be in the letters so people can read them. But it's a good long version.
Yes, it is. Yeah, really interesting. So if you have a chance, have a look at it in the show notes. Kind regards, and that's from Robin. And she has a PS. She was able to find the following case reports of a 66-year-old man in the South Bronx presenting with febrile illness, a walk in the park, a case of babesiosis in the South Bronx, and we have a reference here. And the second case is when 81-year-old man from upstate New York with fevers, malaise, vague abdominal pain, and confusions. And we've got a reference for that as well.
Daniel.
From Friedjof, he writes, hello from South Tyrol, the top of the Alps, where it is a nice 25C 77F, and every evening a thunderstorm passes by, bringing mild night temperatures. For the case of the gentleman presenting with fever, extensive sweats, and hyponatremia, some differential diagnoses come to my mind. Him reporting frequent outdoor activities suggests a tick-borne infection like babesiosis. Other differentials would be ehrlichiosis, anaplasmosis, Lyme disease, although he did not report a rash. Leptospirosis requires contact with water or dead animals. Finally, although least likely, reactivation of decompensating chronic infection with schistosoma japonicum is possible, but would probably lead to eosinophilia. The next diagnostic step would be a blood smear to find intracellular babesia or morule with Ehrlichia anaplasmosis. Yours, Friedjof.
Hazel writes, greetings, TWiPerinos. I am a longtime listener, first-time emailer. I started listening at episode 1 during the pandemic, and I'm still not caught up. Just getting to the end of 2020 now, but I got tired of not having a book. And seeing as there's no plot to follow on this podcast, I skipped to the end to hear the newest case. Of course there's a plot. There's always a plot. I believe the gentleman from Queens has babesiosis. As soon as Daniel mentioned his walks in the park, I started thinking tick-borne, and babesia fits the bill, as it can cause fevers, sweating, especially night sweats, low sodium, anemia, tachycardia, the full Monty. A quick Google confirms that the black-legged tick that transmits the parasite is indeed found in Queens. Given his apparent lack of other major risk factors, I'm sticking with my first instinct. I hope I'm right, but if not, I will try again. Thanks for the years of education and entertainment, and here's to many more. All the best, Hazel from London, not the cool London. We're the one in Canada where it's currently 23 degrees C at 9 p.m., but feels like 30. Yuck. Dixon.
Ayal writes, Dear Vincent and the sages of the eukaryotes, greetings from very hot, sunny, and humid Israel, where the temperature is in the 40s. That's centigrade, not Fahrenheit. The case of the man in his 70s with fever and drenching sweats has me stumped. Sometimes I have a hunch or a clue which sets me off. In this case, I had no idea where to start. On the face of it, fever, sweats, and indication of sepsis would indicate some kind of a blood-borne infection. I guess if Daniel had seen this case in Africa, then malaria would have been the first candidate, but in the U.S. and in Queens, of all places? However, after searching for elevated calcium ions in the blood with regards to parasitic infection, I have learned that this is indeed that can indicate and mediate a plasmodium infection. Considering the patient's extended outdoor walks, climate change, and some previous malaria cases Daniel mentioned in the U.S., I would keep my unlikely guess of malaria and perform a blood smear or an antigen rapid test to confirm. Looking forward to the next episode and returning to Sydney soon. The cold and normalcy would be a welcome change. As always, I'm in awe of you all, of all you do. Ayel.
Christina.
Hawken writes, Hi again from warm, wet Athens, starting to feel like monsoon weather here. Thanks for another fun clinical case to puzzle through and the chance at a signed book. This week's case of high fever, low hematocrit, low platelet count, and the elevated liver enzymes in a patient who hasn't been to an area endemic for malaria in a while and whom takes long walks in the parks reminded me of why we keep cats and dogs on flea tick prevention and why we tell people to wear their DEET and pyrethrin when going outdoors hiking through parks. There's an old joke which comes to mind. What has 4 legs and kicks and ticks a dog? I bungled that joke up. So in this case, it is actually the park's rodents and deer keeping the Ixodes population booming. The patient likely picked up a hitchhiking tick, Ixodes species, likely Ixodes scapularis, and it shared a Babesia species with our patient, quite possibly Babesia microti. This pyroplasm would then go on to replicate intracellularly in our patient's red blood cells and cause fever, lethargy, and anemia. Clinically consistent and likely an autochthonous infection from this local park. Treatment with atavacon and clindamycin, azithromycin. Not sure if you have a good diagnostic test for Lyme in human medicine, but in dogs we have a pretty decent one, and it might be worth screening this individual for it as well, given the shared vector species. If Dr. Griffin could comment on the sodium irregularity with greater detail for the physiology, I would be most interested in hearing his thoughts. Thanks again.
Daniel.
I'll put that in my thing to talk about the sodium. Mark writes, I wanted to see how well ChatGPT would do on this question given the symptoms and blood results, and here's its answer. The symptoms described in Queens, New York, particularly the combination of low-grade fever, drenching sweat, slightly elevated heart rate, and the specific blood test results. Normal white blood cell count, 0 eosinophils, elevated neutrophils and monocytes, low blood sodium, slightly elevated AST/ALT, and slight anemia suggest a possible infection with Lyme disease. Lyme disease is caused by the bacterium Borrelia burgdorferi, which is transmitted through the bite of infected black-legged ticks, Ixodes scapularis, commonly known as deer ticks. These ticks are prevalent in woody and grassy areas, including parks, which are found in Queens, New York. The symptoms of Lyme disease can vary widely, but often include fever, sweats, fatigue, and various abnormalities in blood tests, such as elevated liver enzymes, AST and ALT, and sometimes mild anemia. The specific blood cell findings, elevated neutrophils and monocytes, 0 eosinophils, can also be indicative of an inflammatory response seen in Lyme disease. It's important to note that Lyme disease can present with a range of symptoms, and not everyone infected will have the characteristic bullseye rash erythema migrans. Diagnosis typically involves clinical evaluation along with serological testing, blood tests for antibodies against Borrelia burgdorferi. If someone in Queens, New York experiences these symptoms after spending time in areas where ticks are prevalent, they should seek medical attention promptly for evaluation and possible testing for Lyme disease. Early diagnosis and treatment with antibiotics are crucial to prevent complications of Lyme disease. Now, if I ask ChatGPT without including the blood test results, a different answer is given. In Queens, New York, the parasite that can cause symptoms such as low-grade fever and drenching sweats is Babesia microti. Babesiosis caused by Babesia microti is a parasitic infection transmitted through the bite of infected ticks, particularly the deer tick, Ixodes scapularis. Symptoms of babesiosis can include fever, chills, sweats, fatigue, and muscle aches, similar to malaria. The disease is prevalent in regions where the tick vector is common, including parts of New York such as Queens. Thanks. Mark in Arkansas.
Justin writes, hello to you all. My first thought with the New York patient presenting with fever and drenching sweats was malaria, but the lack of travel makes this unlikely unless malaria has become endemic in the U.S. My second thought was babesiosis, which seems much more likely since this tick-borne disease is endemic to New York State and the patient often walks in parks. I'm sure there are other possibilities, but I think I will settle on babesiosis. If it is babesiosis, I look forward to learning more about this disease as I know very little about it. Thanks for another great episode, Justin. Dixon.
David writes, hello, TWiP. Hello, Team TWiP. Thanks to Dr. Griffin for another case to puzzle over. The clues in TWiP 239 seem to point to alternative potential sources for parasitic infections compared to the string of waterborne encounters in the prior few TWiP episodes. Given that the patient has not traveled outside of Queens, New York area recently and enjoys spending time walking in the local parks, ticks and mosquitoes come to mind as likely parasitic vectors that may be involved in his symptoms. It seems unlikely, though not impossible, that this gentleman ingested a parasite from a soil encounter during the walk, so I am leaning against parasitic infections from that route. I will further speculate, without any evidence, that this gentleman likely stuck to well-maintained trails and pathways in the parks and had limited contact with vegetation from overgrown wooded areas, thus reducing the risk of tick encounters. Within the June 2024 timeframe during which the symptoms began, I suspect there is a high probability of increased mosquito activity in New York, and therefore an increased risk of transmission of disease via those flying pests. My research online pointed towards low sodium and increased monocytes as being associated with West Nile virus infection. Though those symptoms are probably associated with many diseases. That information, along with the assistance of the trusty PDF version of the 7th edition of Parasitic Diseases and a review of the New York Health Department websites, leads me to a guess of West Nile virus for this gentleman. My confidence in this guess is medium at best, but I will stick to it and hope that the force is indeed with me. Thanks again for all you do for science education and updates.
John writes, still hoping to win the textbook. Hello, esteemed host. With some difficulty starting, I got some confident noting Dr. Griffin mentioned walks in the parks around the Queen's area. That led me to Babesia microti as a possible tick-borne vector. The textbooks and 2 videos, Introduction to Human Babesiosis by Elizabeth Maloney, MD, and Parasitic Diseases Lectures, number 18, Protozoans of Minor Medical Importance, helped me narrow parasites down to what the client reported. Fast forward in the lecture to 0 minutes 30 seconds and 21 minutes 13 seconds, with the other video being a 13-minute supplemental with overlapping and additional details. Babesia affects a broad range of hosts, including humans, and thus exists where the client lives as Babesia microti. Dixon might say Babesia is of historical importance, discovered by Smith and Kilburn, because it proved arthropods can transmit infections. Babesia infects red blood cells, and disease manifests in immune-competent people from asymptomatic to mild and can be fatal in immune-compromised or people with no spleen. Asplenic. Epidemiology shows in a recent study that 70% with Babesia became asymptomatic in summer months, with median age 63 and hospitalization higher in elderly and asplenic patients. Transmission occurs mostly by exodus ticks, transfusion, and vertical. I wager the client acquired a parasite from a tick during his outdoor walks. Expected symptoms reported include 6-day fever, elevated AST and ALT, increased heart rate, sepsis, elevated neutrophils, low platelets, and a little anemic. Additionally, hyponatremia or low sodium can be caused by heart, liver, and kidney problems, according to Mayo Clinic, and we see his AST-ALT elevated. I also thought with the drenching sweats, he may be trying to hydrate, and that can further dilute sodium levels. It may help to include intravenous electrolyte or medication and treatments to restore levels. Babesia microti appears restricted to Lyme endemic areas, and 20% of Babesia patients have concurrent Lyme disease, and both can be associated with increased monocytes. Hictum stictum may warrant testing the patient for Lyme as well. Diagnostic testing can be done with blood smear, which can reveal a percentage of red blood cells with erythrocytic ring forms and Maltese cross or tetrad forms, or a Giemsa stain positive for Babesia or serology PCR and Babesia fish. The common treatment that is better tolerated is atavaquone and azithromycin, but also listed is clindamycin and quinine. A heavy parasite load greater than 10% requires exchange transfusion. I would like to know if the client is found to be asplenic and also has Lyme disease. John.
Daniel.
All right, Michelle and Alexander from the First Vienna Parasitology Passion Club write, Dear Twipsters, this month we chose to give our answer in the form of a limerick. Oh no, how did I end up with this one? There once was a patient from China with a fever that wasn't quite minor, with monocytosis from babesiosis, got Mepron with Z-Pak as primer.
Very good.
I like that. On a serious note, that was a serious note in limerick form. We do think this patient may suffer from a case of babesiosis, which is a tick-borne infection that can be contracted in and around New York City. Diagnosis is made via blood smear and PCR testing. Serology is no longer recommended. Symptomatic patients receive atovaquone and azithromycin or quinine and clindamycin for up to 2 weeks. Thank you for this great case. All the best, Michelle and Alexander from the First Vienna Parasitology Passion Club.
Rafid writes, Hello, TWiP team. This case has a broad differential diagnosis. However, you have asked us to limit our answers to parasitic etiologies of this gentleman's symptoms. I have to admit that this case has me a bit stumped. I'm not sure how to fit in the hyponatremia, and the monocytosis and fever into a unifying diagnosis. My most likely guess would be babesiosis infection. However, I also find it curious that the gentleman spoke in Mandarin when addressed in English, so I'm wondering if this is a red herring or whether he may have a mild encephalitis. In that case, an infectious agent spread by arthropod vector could also meet the criteria of a parasitic etiology of fever in this gentleman. So if possible, encephalitis is the concern. I think viral encephalitis secondary to West Nile, St. Louis, Powassan virus is possible. And anaplasma or Ehrlichia infection spread by tick is also in the differential. So in summary, not sure about this one. If I was evaluating this gentleman, I would be testing over a broad differential. If I was sitting in front of a multiple choice exam question, I put babesiosis, assuming it was on one of the choices. Rafid from the depths of rural Quebec. Cheers. Dixon.
Jay writes, Dear TWiP team, I'll be brief. Babesiosis, I could end there. According to my brief perusal of the New York Department of Public Health website, there has been an increase in locally acquired cases in New York City. Staten Island is the borough with the highest reported number of locally acquired cases. There has been a small number of reported cases acquired in Queens. I'm hoping another writer this month can shed some light on the pathophysiology of hyponatremia that can be seen in babesiosis. I'd like to know more about how and why this association. I sign off with my thanks to all of you for your fantastic work. You help keep this work lively and fun. Jay. And he's the chief medical officer at an allied health and wellness center in Los Angeles.
Christina.
Margaret writes, Greetings. Hope all is well with the TWiPers of the world, hosts and listeners all. My guest strays from the strictly TWiP. I sincerely hope Occam is watching over Dr. Griffin's patient, and he only has babesiosis and not babesiosis and Borrelia infection as well. It seems unlikely that non-falciparum plasmodium is at play here, but would you look for that on blood smear while looking for babesia anyway? He probably would have been exposed by an unknown tick bite in Queen's Parks. While I have never been there, I understand Queens is home to a great number of humans and a decent number of rodents, both of whom can be infected with Babesia microti. Margaret in Oregon.
Daniel.
Jason writes, Greetings, TWiP hosts. It is a balmy 29 degrees C here in Seattle. My presumptive diagnosis for the sodium-depleted septuagenarian in episode 239 is babesiosis. My rationale is the presence of fever, sweating, monocytosis, and risk of tick exposure. The monocytosis alone makes malaria a leading contender within the parasite column of the differential diagnosis, yet this non-traveling New Yorker has very little risk of contracting malaria unless it be an airport case or a geographically novel case in the ever-expanding endemic range of the disease. In any case, a thin blood smear should be examined for Maltese cross murozoite forms within erythrocytes. Detection of these yields laboratory confirmation of babesiosis, after which the patient can be prescribed atovaquone, azithromycin. Warm regards, Jason.
Liz writes, Dear TWiP team, I've been listening to TWiP for several months now. I started, like many, listening to TWiP during the pandemic and enjoyed it so much that I expanded my listening to Immune and occasionally TWiVo as well as TWiP. I am no doctor nor academic, but I enjoy learning new things, and parasites are just uncomfortable enough to keep my interest piqued. I think this is the first time that I managed to come up with a guess in time, so here it goes. After a lengthy collaboration with Dr. Google, I've decided the patient may well be suffering from clonorchiasis, the work of Clonorchis sinensis, a Chinese liver fluke. He's obviously suffering from liver damage, and a liver fluke seemed like an obvious possibility, but where did he get it from? Not from walks in the park in Queens. Decades ago, China seemed a bit far-fetched, but I ran across more than one case study of persons becoming symptomatic 50 years after having emigrated from endemic areas, so it's certainly possible. If I prove correct, I would very much appreciate being considered for the book prize. Kind regards, Liz.
David writes, Dear TWiP hosts, greetings from the University of Central Lancashire in the beautiful northwest of England. Summer has arrived and we are enjoying sunshine and temperatures above 200 degrees Celsius. So I think that was misprinted there. I think it's actually
probably 20, right?
20 degrees, so you'd be melting like you wouldn't believe. The case of the Chinese septuagenarian with a fever and drenching sweats suggests a systemic rather than intestinal infection. The initial investigations indicate hemolytic anemia and some liver inflammation. The outdoor lifestyle could easily provide contact with black-legged ticks, Ixodes scapularis, that can be found in the parks on Long Island. And he gives a reference for that, of course. We believe this gentleman may be suffering from babesiosis caused by the apicomplexan parasite Babesia microti. As this patient is symptomatic, although not severe, the treatment protocol recommended by the British Medical Journal would be azithromycin plus atovaquone. We thank you for a stimulating case to investigate and look forward to the next. David.
Christina.
Adam writes, Greetings, TWiP hosts. I'm writing you from beautiful northwest Montana. It is currently 22 degrees and partly cloudy. I believe the gentleman in his 70s that presented with a fever and excessive sweating was suffering from babesiosis. Many parasites can lead to this condition, but the most common in the northeastern US is Babesia microti. The parasite is spread through the bite of a tick, deer tick, which is also common in the northeast. The patient was likely bit during his frequent walks through the parks in his neighborhood. Anemia, thrombocytopenia, hyponatremia, fever, and sweating are all consistent with babesiosis. Thank you, Adam.
Daniel.
Ayana writes, Hello, professors from sunny Jamaica. I am currently visiting for a school reunion to celebrate 20 years of medicine. I will go straight to the case. At least I don't hit submit on my answer. To summarize, we have a man in his 70s from China, lived in Hong Kong, living in the U.S. for a long period, no recent travel, presenting with 6 days of fever and night sweats. Clinically, he's septic, but does not appear to be toxic. His tests are significant for a low hematocrit, low sodium 123, increased neutrophils and monocytes, AST/ALT. Medical history includes hypertension, BPH, social travel history notes that he is retired with no pets and no wife. He also has not had any travel or exotic exposure, but has outdoor activity. Let me start by saying I feel like I need a little more history. any recent use of medication, family history, recent memories of bites while in the park, and also review his skin for a rash. Seems like the type of patient where the history would evolve with every conversation and new nuggets would come forward depending on the person to whom he spoke. That being said, and language barrier accepted, I note that though he may not be HIV positive, this is an elderly patient and his immune system may not respond to illness in the same way. In establishing a differential of some parasitic causes of sepsis that could present like this, I started with the list below: malaria, leishmania, gram-negative sepsis associated with HTLV1 and strongyloides, hyperinfection syndrome, Chagas, African trypanosomiasis, babesiosis, Toxoplasma gondii, amoebiasis. The first thing that came to mind for a patient with this type of history would have the patient presenting as more ill than you have described and would require history of travel or greater immune suppression. In moving away from the things that require travel and additional elements in the history, I will offer that this patient needs to have a full screen for sepsis with some consideration for the wider differential. Though given the social and travel history and clinical presentation, I will keep his differential close to home and wonder if babesiosis is the cause of his clinical presentation. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you for all you do. Regards.
Christian writes, Dear TWiP team, greetings from warm Basel. It is a time of returning travelers and the number of cases of dengue blooming. I've received the book. Thank you very much. Love the style. Regarding the case. Okay, so we can take Christian out of the raffle here.
He received his book.
A classic diagnosis for a parasite in his geographical region would be Babesia. This would explain the low HCT, TCS, hyponatremia, and elevated AST and ALT. It would also fit with the septic criteria, but the patient himself is not feeling incredibly sick. I had to look into the literature, but the hyponatremia could be caused by a SIADH triggered by the Babesia. However, he has hypertension, if I understand HTN correctly. So depending on the medication, the hyponatremia could have been caused by commonly used thiazide diuretics. For this parasite, a blood film showing Maltese cross as used in malaria, or in more affluent settings, a PCR would solidify the diagnosis. Not sure how useful serology would be, as Queens and the surrounding area appear to be endemic for Babesia. If it is Babesia, he probably acquired it during his outdoor activities by being bitten by a tick. Due to the clinical overlap and the recent cases in the USA, in many other areas, a malaria RDT might be prudent, although I am not sure if transmission in Queens is possible. Best wishes from Basel Christian. P.S. Have you ever received the case I have sent you some months ago? Yes, Christian. And one of these days we'll present it. Christian sent us a case to be solved, and we should have it one of these days.
Yeah, we should have him on to present that. That'd be great.
Yep. All right. That's it, Daniel.
Well, I think we have 3 more guessers, right? Who wants to take it? Should we get Dixon off mute? Why don't you go first, Dixon? What are you thinking?
Yeah, well, I was neutral until I started to read the answers. That was kind of cheating, but I don't keep track of the laboratory findings for Babesia very, very religiously, let's put it this way. I have not reviewed that parasite in some time, so I would not have guessed it if I had not read the answers as they came up. So it's kind of unfair for me to offer the standard answer, but I think the standard answer here is babesiosis.
All right.
That's my guess.
Christina, what are you thinking?
So I've been thinking about this case quite a lot, actually. So I think this is a case of babesiosis. I probably agree with most of our listeners. But I was a bit worried about the eosinopenia. And I was wondering if he maybe has a second bacterial infection. Also, I'm slightly worried about because he meets the sepsis criteria. So I would probably look at other infections as well. But based on history of walking a lot outdoors in local parks, and I think ticks are present. You already mentioned that, Daniel. So I think that would probably be fit with babesiosis. And the signs and symptoms that you presented do also fit the diagnosis. The fever and the sweats and the elevated neutrophils and monocytes, which is indicative of an infection, the low platelets, the low hematocrit, and the elevated liver enzymes. And I was thinking about why his sodium is low, and I'm glad another reader, a listener, asked you to explain that a little more. I was wondering, maybe it's because of the hypertension, but maybe because he has medication, but maybe also in combination with the drenching sweats. I'm not sure. And I couldn't really think of another parasites that he might have acquired in New York, based on the other information that you have given us. And I would probably also consider other tick-transmitted infection. I think Anaplasma, Borrelia, and Ehrlichia. I would probably consider that. And maybe actually even Powassan virus, although I don't really know very much about that, but I did read that should be part of a differential. The kind of clinical manifestations that I read about seem to be quite similar to those of babesiosis. So I probably would check for those as well.
All right. Vincent, what are you thinking?
So babesia is quite common in New York State, as we know, and this individual is walking outside and is at risk for acquiring a tick with it. And I think his symptoms and signs are perfectly congruent with babesiosis. So it's there are other possibilities, but I think that's the most likely one.
Okay, so yes, the babesias have it. A couple things we went ahead and did to, I will say, confirm the diagnosis. So blood smear, and this gentleman had parasitemia, was kind of the classic Maltese crosses, and that has to do with the life cycle of the parasite. Also, very quickly, we have a Babesia PCR that came back positive. And what we're kind of, just to go through the features of the case. So, these drenching sweats. It's kind of the classic clinical presentation of the high fevers, the tachycardia with the high fevers. We're now seeing Babesia in all the boroughs. It was actually my one of my partners, Marilyn Fabry, who diagnosed the first case in Queens, which was like right on the border of Queens and Nassau County. And this is a solid in Queens, but we've now seen Babesia in all the boroughs. There's a couple other features that maybe are sort of helpful here. One is people can get quite sick with Babesia. So they could actually get septic from Babesia all by itself. So the fever, the tachycardia, the low sodium level, right? So that's one. What is that about? So actually we see that in malaria as well. And that's actually something that, so the mechanism in certain cases is this SIADH, syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone. So they're actually holding onto water when they should not be. So it's an issue with the kidneys. The exact mechanism of how that's triggered in the AP complexant infections, I'm not certain, but that is part of the mechanism. So you don't actually need to have the hypertension or the diuretic called into play. And it's not necessarily just a repletion, because there is, it's actually a Bayesian. There's a positive predictive value for what organism it is based on whether or not you're going to see hyponatremia. So the parasite, you're thinking Babesia, you're thinking malaria. Interesting. The low hematocrit, right? The anemia, that's going to be also another hint here. The eosinopenia, the low eosinophil count, that's going to help us. Also going to give us a gauge of severity. Our sicker individuals will have that low eosinophil count. And another, which is really, I'm going to say sort of a tick-borne clue, tick-borne pathogen clue, is this increased monocyte count. The other thing, which I really think sort of hats off to some of our emailers, listeners, is the reference to John Hickam and Hickham's dictum, right? So I always like to say Occam was not a physician, John Hickam was. A patient can have as many diseases as they darn well choose. And I think he used a word other than darn. But 20% of the time we see a Babesia case, they got something else going on. And so that's always really important for us to look for the morally, I guess is how that's pronounced, the plural of morula. When we see that with an anaplasma infection, we also see Ehrlichia, we also see Lyme co-infection. So it's important not just to say, oh, it's Babesia, that's going to explain everything, because we really see a lot of co-infections with these other tick-borne diseases.
It might also be important to mention that if you've had a splenectomy and you catch Ehrlichia, or rather babesiosis, the fatality rate is quite high among those people.
Yeah.
So there used to be warnings on a lot of the islands off the coast of the United States, particularly off the Massachusetts coast, big signs that say, if you don't have a spleen, go home. Not quite like that, but it was a warning that the ticks had played a role in several deaths. I remember when that first happened, and people were now very much aware of that. And of course, you're going to wonder, well, what are these islands doing with deer? I mean, what are they doing out there? How did they even get there? And there's no easy explanation for that, by the way, because the ocean doesn't freeze over to allow the wolves to chase them onto that island.
Deer
They're
great swimmers. I've actually been out.
Deer are wonderful swimmers. You're absolutely right. So, but why would they want to go from the mainland to an island? Why would they want to do that? Maybe the traffic along I-95 was just too much for them. And
curiosity, Dixon.
Curiosity. So, it's interesting to see how peri-domestic deer have become.
Yeah, and how do they find the islands delightful?
That's right, exactly right. Just like two elephants in the tall grass, that's right.
Yeah. No, it's actually, so that's the nickname, right? You're sort of right. The Nantucket fever, originally the description in the Portuguese splenic fishermen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And
so Daniel, did he have another infection on top of the babesiosis?
So this gentleman didn't, but the same weekend I saw another case, and that woman actually did have a co-infection. So we see it. We see a lot of Babesia now, really become an endemic area, really spread from the islands. But I think part of it also is we're better at diagnosing it. Right, 70% of cases are asymptomatic. So a lot of these cases, I think, went diagnosed. And so once you start picking up on all the subtle clues, you start testing, you might make a couple diagnoses in the weekend, and maybe if people weren't thinking about it, the diagnoses were being missed, right? And a lot of this, if you've got an intact immune system, if you have a spleen, the majority of the time you're going to get better despite us not knowing what's going on. But if we know what's going on, we make the diagnosis, offer appropriate treatment, we're going to start realizing that there's a lot more cases.
Dixon.
Yes.
In nature, the ticks feed on which animals?
Well, they feed on mice. The kangaroo mouse, which looks a little bit like a kangaroo, but not too much. It's got white feet, though, so it's often also called the white-footed mouse. Peromyscus is the name of it. So the nymph, the larva and the nymph feed on two different rodent models, so to speak, or rodent hosts, and finally the adult tick feeds on the deer itself. So the ones that you're really worried about are the nymphs, because they're so small that you can barely see them. And as Bob Grodz used to give in our lecture in the medical school, so they look like a moving freckle. So, but they can also carry this infection because it's transovarially transmitted from the mother tick off to the babies. And it's remarkable that a protozoan parasite can actually do that. It's so large. I can imagine, viruses, for instance, but to imagine, quite interesting to see the biology of this thing play out. And the further north you go from New York City, the more densely populated the deer population is, and the more likely it is that all the ticks are infected. And finally, you get up into late Westchester County and back up even further than that to a place called the Carey Institute for Ecological Studies. And they've got a guy there. His name is Ostfeld. His first name I'm blocking on right now, but he's an expert on the ecology of this infection because he's right in the heart of the center of 50% of all the ticks are infected with this thing. Can you imagine such a high ratio that your chances of, if you're bitten by a tick, it's likely that you will get this. So, yeah, it's quite interesting, actually.
So humans are accidental hosts.
Much, absolutely.
Because they don't transmit it, obviously.
That's right. Although I presume that there is a possibility if you were a silent carrier and you gave blood, you could transmit it through transfusion.
Yeah, we occasionally see that. Yeah, and it is interesting. You can have a chronic Babesia parasitemia. So I guess we could potentially, but we're not normally part of this wonderful life cycle.
What about a pregnant woman passing it off to her offspring before they're born?
Yeah, let me just check that quickly.
I don't think red cells classically travel across the blood-brain, the placental barrier, but I bet you there have been some cases where
there's been congenital transmission. So that's
And I was just looking up for the listeners that are joining us from Europe. Babesiosis, human babesiosis, is really still quite rare in Europe. So there's other tick-borne diseases you probably need to worry more if you hail from my parts of the world.
Yes.
Lyme disease, and I think there has been a few cases of tick-borne encephalitis in the south of England, certainly very present in mainland Europe. But not much human babesiosis. Quite a few cases of dog babesiosis, though, I've seen in some veterinary journals.
Yeah,
and I think the peridomestic aspect of deer in the United States is remarkable, and I think maybe that accounts for our being the epicenter for this disease. And they've tried like heck to get rid of them in places like Eastern Long Island, where they've tried to hire bow hunters to come in at night and cull the deer, or to use implantable sterilization technologies that they've tried without success, totally without success. And a lot of people I know, Vincent, you have deer coming out to your lawn. Daniel, do you have deer out to where you live?
We do, and it's really tough because you have to get rid of every single deer, because I sort of liken it to like the one, there's a town and there are 4 bars, so they shut all the bars and only one is left open. So everyone just goes to the last bar. So there's one deer, and then all the ticks are just all over that one deer. So
that's right.
You have to get rid of them all.
Right.
How I have lots of deer here, so how would I be at risk for tick bites?
So it's an excellent question, right? For our listeners that are living in areas where there are ticks. So, one is you can just sort of easily be out and about, and the ticks will have this sort of seeking behavior where they actually get to the tips of the grass and they can jump and get onto you. So, and since as Dixon described, these are like moving freckles, they're so tiny. It's not the ticks that you find, it's these tiny nymphs that you don't find. And those tiny moving freckles will actually go up into sort of the deep, dark places where, your closest friends won't even be willing to search you for tink, for the nymphs, right? So, I joked one time a picture of me with lame disease, which is where I've tucked my pants into my socks. But things like, DEET, picaridin, permethrin, things like that, keeping the lawn sort of cut short, keeping away from the bushes. Then pets are a big thing. If you don't have your animals treated, my wife always gets upset when I put in the tick treatment, because it makes their coat a little bit greasy, apparently. But yeah, your animals will go out and they'll have a nymphal tick and you won't even notice. And then that nymphal tick is then introduced to the house. So I had a case where there was a woman who was really very much homebound, but the daughter had a dog and would visit with the dog, and we kind of figured out that's how they ended up with, in that case, it was Ehrlichia, but again, another tick-borne disease. A woman almost didn't survive from that. So you can get it from our animals. We can get it from being out. And as we're describing here, you could be like in a city park. These ticks are really everywhere. It's not like you have to be out in the mountains camping or really doing anything exotic.
That's right.
Would you see a fully fed nymphal tick at all, or are they still really teeny tiny, even if when they're fully fed? I've never seen one, so I don't know.
So when
small.
when the first gets on, it's really, really tiny. But as time goes by, there's actually some people probably can Google on the internet. You can actually see the enlargement over time.
So it's. I'm not going to walk on the grass anymore.
Don't do that. You just got out of mowing the lawn, Vincent.
Well,
I don't know if you know that, but
I haven't mowed it for a while. But I got rid of that.
Good.
But there are pets here, so I have to do something about that.
Yeah.
You could also use DEET, couldn't you?
I could, yes, but but as Daniel said, the pets are treated with that stuff. You put it on the back of their neck, and they're greasy for a while, and
That's right.
I presume it works for a while, and that.
Yeah,
so any ticks that go on, they're repelled, right, Daniel?
Yeah, so it's a once a month treatment. There's even an oral, which we do as well. We've got kind of like it's like the beginning of each month, and they get their parasitic stuff. They get their insect stuff, and the coating. Yeah,
a little bit of ivermectin too.
Yeah, I mean,
a little bit of ivermectin.
In the oral stuff, there's some ivermectin in there.
That's right.
It tastes like
I think it's HeartGuard. It's called HeartGuard.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
But don't take it for COVID, folks. It doesn't work.
But the HeartGuard is not for ticks, though. It's for mosquitoes.
Yep. All right.
So we have a story here. Who's going to talk about this?
Well, I think before we do that, we got to give something away, right?
So
by the way, this gentleman did quite well. They were treated, discharged, and they did well. So, but do we have a book? How many people?
All right, so we had 15 people, so let's do a random number between 1 and 15. You ready, Dixon?
I'm ready.
Number 14. That's easy. It's Adam.
Number 4. I remember the joke.
From beautiful Northwest Montana. So, Adam, send an email to TWiP at microbe.tv. In the subject line, TWiP 241 book winner, and with your address, and we will ship you a book.
No, don't ship it. I'll hand deliver it.
Yeah, you want to go to Montana? Okay.
I do. I would love to go out there and hand deliver that to him.
Once upon a time, you and I went fishing out there, remember?
We did. We went to Hamilton, Montana.
It was a lot of fun.
That's in northwestern.
Yeah,
Montana.
That is northwest Montana. My first real job as a doctor was in Montana. I love Montana.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Helena, the capital.
Okay.
Helena, of course.
Book given away.
Yep.
Worm story.
Yeah. So
the worm story.
So Dixon wanted us to talk about this, and so
I'd be happy to if you.
You
want me to.
You can go ahead, and then let's have a whole discussion.
The first notice of this was in Yahoo News, one of my favorite evening humorous reads before I go to bed, because of so much misinformation that's transmitted through that august organization, the Yahoo News. But in this case, they had an Olympic swimmer who was complaining that the food was so bad that they even had worms in them. And, that's an insult to French cooking. I would have thought that this would be a great place for the Olympics because the food would be so awesome. Well, as the story unfolded, it wasn't in all the food. It was only in fish. And so that narrowed it down to a very few kinds of worms. And the anisakids ruled the roost in that sense. That's what this turned out to be, I presume. Although I haven't seen a definitive diagnosis yet.
Yeah, I was going to actually. So let me read a little bit because I am going to say that this was maybe a little bit of unfair commentary by this particular swimmer. So this is a little excerpt from Yahoo News, where as part of the Olympic sustainability efforts, organizers committed to increasing plant-based food options at the games, predominantly for spectators and workers. Nutritionists and dozens of athletes were consulted on this plan, organizers said. Petey, that's our swimmer, Petey said the plant-based options weren't suitable for many athletes. The narrative of sustainability has just been pushed on the athletes, he said. I want meat. I need meat to perform. And that's what I eat at home. So why should I change? I like my fish and people are finding worms in the fish. It's just not good enough, added Petey, who won silver in Paris in the 100-meter breaststroke.
Yeah, he would have won gold.
So I will comment that as interesting as it sounds, it's hearsay. There have been no pictures of said worms, no evidence of any worms in fish reported, and no specific complaints other than this offhand comment.
You are right.
So,
you are absolutely right. So that's one of the reasons why I read Yahoo News. Really, it's almost believable.
Almost. It reminds me of my grandmother, right? Don't let the truth stand in the way of a good story. And here we have a good story.
Exactly right.
Very good. Okay, now it's time for a hero.
Yes, I've got a hero today. So I'd like to talk to you, or I'd like to just talk to our listeners about Antony van Leeuwenhoek. Some of you will have heard of him already. I chose him because he's maybe an unlikely scientist when we consider his upbringing and his background. And those of you who do know Antony van Leeuwenhoek, you will know him as the pioneer of microbiology. And that's really what I'd like to celebrate today, because he's done some great work. So Antony van Leeuwenhoek, he was born in Delft in the Netherlands. You can buy some really nice china in Delft, actually. Nice white and blue, but that's off topic, I suppose. So he was born in 1632. I don't really know much about his early years, but he was from a family of tradesmen, so not scientists. They were not wealthy. And so he didn't really have the privilege of higher education. He has never attended university. And at that time, higher education and university degrees were essential to be acknowledged in the scientific community. And so if you think about that, this kind of makes his achievements even more remarkable. So when he was 16, he became an apprentice to a textile merchant. And I think that's probably when he first saw magnifying glasses, because these were really important tools of the trade, because with the magnifying glasses, you could count the thread densities in cloth, which is important to establish the quality of the fabric. So when he completed his apprenticeship, he set up as a linen draper, essentially a fabric merchant. So he did well, and he took on different roles. Always in Delft. He worked also as a surveyor, and he was also a minor city official. He did, I don't know how the opportunity arose, because traveling wasn't really, wasn't really something that was done as easily as we do today. But he did visit London in 1668, and it is thought that it is probably there where he saw a copy of a book that is called Micrographia by Robert Hooke, which was published a few years before then. And that book included pictures of textiles, which I assume is where his interest, or why he was interested in a book. But he then started use magnifying glasses or lenses to examine the natural world around him. And I think that really makes him stand out as a scientist. And he also began to make lenses. I read that he made over 500 such microscopes, and some of these allowed him to magnify objects up to 200 times. Now we have less than 10 that have survived, and that can be seen in museums. I'd really love to see one, that's for sure. They were very basic in design, nothing like the microscopes that we use today. They were really powerful magnifying glasses. They contained one lens, and they were mounted in a tiny hole in a brass plate that makes up the body of the instrument. And then you would mount the specimen on the sharp point that sticks up in front of the lens, and its position and focus could then be adjusted by turning the two screws that were also on that little instrument. It was quite small, I think about 3 to 4 inches, which is around 10 centimeters. And to use it, you had to hold it up really close to the eye. I'm sure it needed really good lighting and a really steady hand, but also a lot of patience. So what I just want to say is that actually Van Leeuwenhoek, he did not invent the microscope as such. Compound microscopes had actually been invented much earlier in 1595, but they were not nearly as good as magnifying specimens as Van Leeuwenhoek's magnifying glasses were. They were useful for specimens to magnify them maybe 20 to 30 fold. But Leeuwenhoek, he was really good at grinding lenses, and he had really, really good eyesight, and he was a really good observer. And I think that, together with his ability to reproduce what he saw, contributed to his fame. And he was really able to produce a clearer and brighter image than any of his contemporary microscopists. He wasn't a good illustrator, but he was excellent at describing what he saw, and he worked with an illustrator who translated his descriptions into pictures. So in the 1670s, he began corresponding with the Royal Society in London, and he was one of the first to observe blood cells and microscopic single-cell protists, both free-living and parasitic. He also saw tiny nematodes and rotifers, and also bacteria, and these he described as many very little living animalcules. So he was then recognized in 1680 when he became a member of the Royal Society. And I think that's quite an achievement, considering he was essentially a fabric merchant, not a trained scientist. He never went to London again, so he never went to any meetings of the Royal Society, but he was still a member. And so really for the last 50 years of his life, he just ended up corresponding, writing letters to the Royal Society. They were translated into English or Latin, and they were printed in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, which is actually a publication that is still published now. I think it's called Transactions B. So Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society B, I think that's the name of it now, but I wouldn't have to look that up. So, he wrote many letters and described many protists. And I just want to read you a tiny extract of one of such a letter, because I think that's quite nice to kind of witness how he experienced things. So that's a quote now. In structure, these little animals were fashioned like a bell, and at the round opening they made such a stir that the particles in the water thereabout were set in motion thereby. And though I must have seen quite 20 of these little animals on their long tails alongside one another, very gently moving, with outstretched bodies and straightened out tails, yet in an instant, as it were, they pulled their bodies and their tails together, and no sooner had they contracted their bodies and tails than they began to stick their tails out again very leisurely, and stayed thus some time, continuing their gentle motion, which sight I found mightily diverting. I think that is really quite beautiful. Actually, I might look up a book and maybe read a little bit more about that. So that description is about a ciliate, vorticella, about which I don't really know very much, but I just thought that little extract was really nice. So that's Antony van Leeuwenhoek. Although not a trained scientist, he was skilled and diligent and endlessly curious with an open mind. And I think it's really these attributes that allowed him to make some of the most important discoveries in the history of biology. So let's celebrate Antony van Leeuwenhoek.
You bet. Christina, do me a favor and ask Daniel what his tie and Anton van Leeuwenhoek have in common.
Oh, that's interesting.
The Giardia,
yeah. The Giardia. There is
the Giardia, yeah.
Where did Leeuwenhoek actually get Giardia?
So if I remember the story correctly, it was his own Giardia that he looked at.
That is correct.
Yes.
Oh, nice. Now that shows you the breadth
dedication.
and depth. The breadth of who among us, if we had been in that situation, would have thought to look in our own stool, something that is despised mostly by society. There are many slang names for it. None of them are complimentary. And yet Van Leeuwenhoek sits at his desk and he says, I wonder what swims around in my stool. and he was member of a club. He formed a club, and he made his microscopes for his club members, and they all came back and reported on various saliva and eye tears and cerumen and all kinds of bodily fluids, and whether they had something in them or not, they reported on it anyway. So that's a great choice, by the way. He's one of my all-time heroes, and one of his microscopes is on display in Leiden at the museum, and you can actually go see that. And they're not much to look at. They look very simple, but it's a hanging drop technology that he developed that was quite remarkable.
Yeah, it's just amazing his kind of skills that he had, and
absolutely.
It's just like that. He was so curious, and from looking at fabric threads to
well, that's right.
To decide whether a sheet was of good quality or not. He went on to describe all these amazing creatures.
Yeah. That's right. And so we have on the TWiP, at least not the TWiP, but the TWiP, we have a saying. It says, "Remain curious." And I think that could be his motto that we could identify him with.
TWiP, right? Stay curious. I love that.
Stay
curious. All right. Thank you, Christina. Daniel?
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Do you have another case for us?
So I do, and I'm going to give everybody the whole story. So now it's up to everyone to tell us, when you got all this, well, what is this? What's going on? And what should we do? So this is a recent case. So I don't know if our listeners know, but for many years, every Wednesday at 1:30, I would do this conference for our urgent care providers in the New York tri-state area, where we have over 100 urgent care centers. Now I'd sort of do my once a month cameo, but so this was a case. I did my presentation, and then this was a case that was put forth by one of our providers. And so here's this woman in her 20s, previously healthy, and she comes to one of our urgent cares in the New York tri-state area reporting, and I quote, "I've seen small white worms in my stool since yesterday." The small round white worms are about a centimeter in length, so a little less than half an inch in length, little tiny white worms. She reports that she recently returned from a trip to Mexico, where she stayed in a luxury resort. She reports never leaving the resort, only drinking bottled water. Does volunteer that she did eat from the salad bar, the buffet at the resort. She reports some lower abdominal cramping, but no actual pain. She reports no fever, no chills, no rash, no diarrhea, no rectal pain, no anal itching. Her exam's unremarkable, and to the chagrin of this poor provider, she refuses a rectal exam. Blood work's unremarkable. So at this point, given this history, the provider orders a ova and parasite that comes back negative.
Okay.
So
HIV.
that's all you get.
That's it. No HIV status?
It's all you get. You get this, and then,
Really?
You just.
I wanted to ask how recently she returned from the trip.
She just got back.
So it was about
a 1 week trip, sort of a have fun vacation. She's just gotten back.
But what's her HIV status?
She's negative for HIV.
What? Who else went?
So I will capitalize on the previously healthy. This is a woman in her 20s, went off to had a fun time, no medical problems in the past, no diagnoses, just concerned that she's got these white worms.
Did she have any trysts while she was there?
I wonder. She may have.
Did she go by herself, or did she go with someone?
These are all good questions, Vincent.
Does she live with anyone? Did she live alone?
So the best I get is that she's single and she had a lot of fun on this trip. There may have been drinking. There may have been staying up late.
Okay. Did she describe whether those small white worms were motile?
Yes, they're actually motile.
So she knew what the word motile meant.
They were moving. They were moving about.
So Daniel, how long did she pass these worms? One day, once, or multiple days?
So she noticed it the day before, and immediately the next day came to the urgent care. So she comes back from Mexico. It's a day or so, notices these, says, "Oh my gosh, I just went to Mexico. I got worms. What's going on?"
How did she notice
that? I wouldn't blame that one on Mexico.
So Dixon, we don't want to say too much. We don't want to say too much. I may or may not share your opinion.
Does she live at home?
She's got her own place.
Well, where's she going to live, Dixon, besides home?
What is she? No. She should live with her parents.
Well, there's a lot of good extra questions that could be brought to bear, but let's not. No spoilers.
But Daniel doesn't want to.
You haven't told us what she did for a living.
That's true. I haven't done that either.
And you won't either.
I felt like I already knew the answer at this point.
Yeah.
I think so.
What does she do for a living, Daniel?
That's a good question. Maybe we'll revisit that.
All right. Okay. That'll do it for TWiP 241. Now, if you want to take a guess at this case, send an email to twip@microbe.tv. In the subject line, put TWiP 241 case, and we will be taking your guesses until September 2nd. Okay? September 2nd. TWiP 241, twip@microbe.tv. That'll do it for TWiP 241. What do you think about that? Show notes are at microbe.tv/TWiP. Case guesses, questions, comments, twip@microbe.tv. Daniel, one more thing. If you really enjoy these programs, we'd love to have your support to continue them and all the science programs of Microbe TV. Go to microbe.tv/contribute. Daniel Griffin, Columbia University Irving Medical Center, parasiteswithoutborders.com. Thank you, Daniel.
Oh, thank you. And everyone, be safe.
Dixon Despommier, trichinella.org, thelivingriver.org. Thank you, Dixon.
Thank you, Vincent. Great show.
Christina Niles is at the University of Glasgow. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you. And I'm off to try my strawberry jam before bed.
Good luck. Hope it's good.
I hope so.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at microbe.tv. I'd like to thank the American Society for Microbiology for their support of TWiP and Ronald Jenkins for the music. So who's going to do it?
I'm going to do it.
Good.
I got it this time.
You've been listening to This Week in Parasitism. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon.
Another TWiP is parasitic.